friends. Welcome to Foggy Oak Fairy Tales, a stories podcast for all ages, where we tell farm stories from real-life happenings on Foggy Oak Farm, as well as fantasy tales to spark both learning and imagination. I'm so glad you're here. Earlier, we had a story about a fellow named Hans who was born on a leap year and believed he was the luckiest man alive. He interpreted every event that happened through that belief. This month's episode features a woman with a similar outlook on life, as well as a mischievous shapeshifter who really tries to test her sunny outlook. Like our recent story, Fairies in the Chimney, this is an adaptation of a story collected and written by Joseph Jacobs in More English Fairy Tales from 1894. And I appreciate the lightheartedness of several of the tales he collected, including this one. Traditional fairy tales can be scary and magical and moralistic, but they can also be fun and silly too. Once upon a time and long ago, in the village of Hedley on the Hill in Northumberland, England, there lived an old woman who was known for her cheerful disposition. She didn't have much, but she got by and was well loved by one and all. Over the years, she had developed a habit of taking a stroll in the summer evenings as the sun was beginning to set and the verdant countryside was awash in the light of that golden hour. Some folk said that at that time of day it was wisest to stay close to home and avoid the chance of running into any of the fairies and other fey folk who might be flitting about and taking their own enjoyment in lovely evenings. But in all her years, she had never run across so much as a fairy ring, let alone an actual fairy. She figured they tended to their own as she tended to hers, and didn't spare much of a worry for anything on her strolls, other than making it home before dark. Still, every evening when she set off on her walk, her neighbor would call to her, "Now mind you watch out for that Hedley Kow. I hear tell there's no trick it won't pull for a laugh." She'd chuckle and wave and head off on her walk, and never felt the slightest concern she'd happen upon that infamous local trickster. This particular evening was especially fine, and she was enjoying the sweet fragrances on the summer breeze and the way the light played off the leaves of the lush trees growing along the side of the road. She had just arrived at her usual turning point, the crossroads at the end of the lane, when she spotted an odd black lump lying in the weeds next to the fork of the crossroad. Drawing closer, she saw that it was an enormous cast iron pot, lid and all. And sure, it was a little rusty and beaten up, but she could see what a fine pot it had been at one time. "Now, who could have left this here?" she exclaimed. "Perhaps it fell off someone's cart? Perhaps, more likely, someone tossed it for having a hole and being a bit rusty. Well, no matter, a lovely big pot like that, even with a hole, could be used for so many things, even just to hold a lovely flower. I could gather one on my evening strolls. Wouldn't that be fine? I'll just take it home and see how many ways I can find to use it." She stooped to lift the pot by the handle, but it was so heavy that it threw her off balance. She fell to the ground, and the lid of the pot slid right off to the ground as well. Righting herself and slowly standing, she bent to pick up the lid. And that was when she saw that the pot was absolutely chock full of gold pieces. "How can this be?" she gasped, leaning close to take a look and running her hands through the coins. "Why, this is even luckier than finding the pot. Imagine what I could do with such riches." She was so excited by this development that she paced in a circle around the pot, waving her hands and exclaiming over and over again, "What luck! What luck!" Still, the pot had to be brought back home with her for it to do any good, and she had already seen how very heavy it was. She determined that instead of trying to carry it, she would wrap her shawl around the handle and drag it along behind her. So she carefully placed the lid back on the pot, tied her shawl around the handle, and proceeded to drag it along behind her, making slow progress back towards her cottage and wondering aloud all the while at her incredible good fortune. Eventually, she simply had to take a rest and stopped to sit for a moment, planning to use the pot itself for a kind of stool. But when she turned to make sure the lid was secure to sit down upon, she found that she wasn't dragging a pot filled with gold pieces at all. It was, in fact, a giant lump of purest silver. She hardly trusted her eyes in the darkening twilight, but there could be no question as she ran her hands over it and turned it over in the road. Clearly, she had imagined the pot. But how on earth could she have mistaken a lump of silver for a giant old cast-iron pot? "Well, that's a change for the better in any case," she muttered to herself as she rubbed her eyes. "For who'd have believed I'd have come into gold pieces anyway? And then you'd have to worry about other folks thinking of stealing some for themselves, and it'd be no end to trouble, surely. No, a fine lump of silver is much better and safer than gold, and I'm still richer than rich." She thought perhaps she'd find the silver to be easier to drag along behind her than she'd found her imaginary pot of gold, but it felt just as heavy and stubborn to drag along as that old pot had. Still, she made slow and steady progress until, at last, again, she needed to take a break. She knew home wasn't far, but she just couldn't go another step without a rest. She turned to sit down on her lump of silver, but it suddenly became clear that whatever she was dragging didn't shine and glint the way the silver had. She moved her shawl aside and gasped. Oh my! It's not a lump of silver at all. It's a lump of pure iron." "Well, no wonder it was so heavy, and goodness knows why I ever thought it was silver or a pot of gold at all. And isn't this lucky? A lump of iron is ever so much easier to deal with and make use of than gold or silver. And isn't this lucky? A lump of iron is ever so much easier to deal with and make use of than gold or silver. Why, I can sell this as easy as a whistle and get pennies enough to keep me for years. And never will I need to worry about having gold or silver lying around and tempting trouble to come down on me. Oh, this is lucky." She forgot all about her need to rest and set off again, now dragging the lump of iron behind her. Again, after a bit, though, she needed a rest. She turned to sit upon the iron and, to her decreasing surprise, found that she was not, in fact, dragging a lump of iron, but a huge stone. "Well, aren't I the fortunate one?" she exclaimed. "For no matter that I've imagined so many different things, each time it turns out to be something better than the time before. For this stone is most exactly the thing I needed more than any other. Why, this is just the ticket for what I've been hunting for to hold my door open to let in the fresh summer breezes. Ah, what a lucky change, and how fortunate am I to have such good luck." Forgetting again about her desire to rest, she picked up the pace and hustled home, eager to see how well the stone would look propped just so against her door. She made it back to her little cottage and turned to unwrap her shawl from the stone so she could move it into place by her door. But just as soon as she had untied her shawl, the stone gave a great jump and a screech as it expanded to the size of a plow horse. The stone shook and out popped 4 long, lanky legs. It shook again to unfurl 2 long goat-like ears. It shook again to prize free a curling tail. And it shook again to produce what looked to her startled eyes like the head of a miniature dragon. The creature kicked its feet, waggled its tail, and gave a great wink to the old woman, and then bolted away, cackling like a delighted child as it ran down the lane and out of sight. The woman was so shocked, she sat right down on the bench outside her door. Well, if I'm not the luckiest woman in the country, I don't know who is. Fancy that this whole time I've been dragging the Hedley Kow along behind me and never knowing till now. What a thing to have been tricked by the Hedley Kow. She shook her head, hardly able to comprehend her good fortune, and sat on her bench to watch the sun finish setting, perfectly content. The end. Remember, you're part of the story too. What did you think of this story? What did you imagine when you were listening? We'd love to hear your part of the story. If you and your grown-up want, you can share your thoughts or a picture you drew with our Foggy Oak podcast family. You might find it easiest to share with us on Facebook at Foggy Oak Farm, but we have lots of options on our website, foggyoakfairytales.com. You can also check out pictures from the farm and learn more about us. Thanks for being part of the story, and I hope you'll join us next week.